Hello and welcome to my Week 6 presentation. This week's topic is major revenue sources with a focus on taxes. As a brief overview, we will talk about the City of Burbank's fiscal year 24-25 annual budget as it relates to the major revenue types for the City of Burbank. We'll also discuss whether those major revenue types are progressive or regressive, and I'll have a slide with my references and, of course, my closing. So in order to identify the major sources of revenues for the City of Burbank, we need to take a look at their funds as a whole and see which ones house the largest revenue generating activity. As you can see on this table, which is a very high level overview of the city's resources and appropriations extracted from their adopted annual budget document, the fund groups with the largest activities are the General Fund, and their Electric and Water Enterprise Fund, also known as BWP or Burbank Water and Power. So as you can see on this slide, the City of Burbank has a lot of different fund groups, fund types, and a lot of different resources that fold into those major categories. For the purposes of this presentation, we won't focus on utility rates, which affect the Electric and Water Fund, or their BWP fund, but instead we'll take a look at the General Fund, which is the most applicable fund type for this class and this topic. So what we'll do today is we'll drill into the $247 million that's highlighted on this slide. So that $247,436,128 is demonstrated here on this pie chart that looks more like a donut, and you'll notice that the largest revenue sources for the general fund are three things: property taxes, sales taxes, and service charges. Property taxes, based off of the calculation of these numbers, account for 30.29% of the revenues in the general fund, followed closely by sales tax revenues, which comprise 26.03% of their general fund revenues, and lastly, the third largest category is the city's service charges, which accounts for 10.33% of their general fund revenues. So let's take a quick look and do a slightly deeper dive on these major revenue categories. Property taxes comprise $74.96 million of their general fund revenues. Sales taxes comprise $64.41 million of their revenues, and service charges comprise $25.56 million of their revenues. To further understand the focus of this presentation, we'll briefly cover service charges because that's kind of like an outlier. It's not necessarily a tax. So if we look down at the bottom of this slide at that $25.56 million, service charges are really kind of user fees and charges for some of the services that the city provides. You'll notice that there are maybe three major departments that charge a service fee for the service that they provide, namely Community Development Department fees, the Fire Department fees, and Parks and Recreation fees. And service charges can really vary depending on the department. For example, community development fees might be, money generated from business licenses, building permits, plumbing permits, technical review, etc. Fire departments can charge for false alarms or brush clearance or maybe fire permits. And then, of course, Parks and Recreation fees would be the charges for classes and programs, for example. But for the purposes of this class, we'll focus on property taxes and sales taxes. So let's first take a look at property taxes. And property taxes are a major revenue source for local governments, as these are taxes that are collected based on the assessed value of property. And they're widely thought of as regressive because property taxes are based on the assessed value of property and not on the income levels of the property owners, which can disproportionately affect low or fixed income earners as their earning power and income levels aren't factored into how much property taxes they need to pay. In fact, an article in 1983 by William Harris had noted that around the 60s, the demand for public services really grew. And as those demands grew, so did the need for governments to increase taxes in order to keep up with the cost of providing those increased public services. And at the time, the general sentiment was that it caused an unfair burden on low or fixed income earners. And that's where Prop 13 really comes in, which passed in the late 70s, that really put a limit on the property taxes that can be assessed. It limited California property taxes to 1% of the assessed value of the property. The next major revenue source for the city of Burbank, and I think for a lot of cities here in California, is sales taxes. And sales tax is really a tax on the sale of goods. It's typically a fixed percentage that's added to the price of taxable items when they're purchased. Now, sales taxes are also regressive, but it may not be as obvious, and I'll come back to that later. But it's, a flat tax rate that's paid by everyone, regardless of their income levels. And so the amount is the same if you make more or less money. It doesn't really matter. So why might sales taxes not be as obviously regressive? Well, there was a study done by Joel Slemrod that took a look at attitudes around different tax rate structures in the country and found that there's a considerable amount of people that believe that replacing the existing income tax structure with alternative tax structures such as a flat rate tax structure, which is what a sales tax is, was really rooted in the fact that there were certain public misconceptions about our tax structure. And the interesting part about that is that taxes really do reflect the attitudes and the communities and the environments that we live in. Sales tax rates, for example, can vary from state to state, from county to county, and even city to city. So, for example, here in the city of Monrovia, Monrovians voted back in 2019 to increase the sales tax rate from 9.5% to 10.25%. That was known as Measure K, and Measure K passed essentially increasing the sales tax that we charge ourselves here in the city of Monrovia, with the intention of being able to keep that 0.75% sales tax as local revenues here. So I think that's really an interesting point about taxes, especially sales taxes, is that it can vary depending on the community, the environment, the attitudes of the residents that live within that jurisdiction. And with that, I have here the list of references that I used for this presentation. Thank you so much for your time, and I appreciate your feedback.